Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Word Balloon, the comic book conversation show. John Suntress here. Great conversation today. Danny Fingeroff, the wonderful Marvel editor, writer, the creator of Right Now, an excellent Tomorrow's magazine that I think was instrumental in the way that they would examine the art of comic book writing. It no longer exists, but it was a great magazine while it lasted. Danny's been involved with a lot of projects and a lot of publishers and done a lot of work in and around the comic book industry. In fact, one of his current jobs is coordinating and coming up with the panels for a lot of the Wizard Comic-Cons across the country. In fact, he's coming to Chicago in just a couple weeks for Wizard World Chicago. I still call it Wizard World Chicago. They call it Wizard Comic-Con Chicago. Okay, whatever. I sound like Trump. Okay, whatever. It's excellent, and people are going to love it. So it's a fun conversation. Infamously, Danny is known for being one of the editors on the Clone Saga, and you'll hear the shields immediately go up when I mention it, because I didn't originally read the Clone Saga. I remember I kind of checked out on comics around the death of Aunt May, and I'm just like, all right, whatever. And I knew that the Clone Saga was starting, but that was literally one of the last Spider-Man comics I read, and until... God, I want to say when J. Michael Straczynski was writing the book right after Howard Mackey's run on Spider-Man. So that's kind of when I came back to Spider-Man. And, of course, Ultimate Spider-Man with Bendis is another way that I came back to a Spider-Man. But, eventually we do get to talk about that. But we talk about when Danny was a writer. We talk about his time writing Dazzler, which I think, as he points out, was kind of a unique character that on the one hand was ignored, but on the other hand, you still had to, come up with interesting ideas for her. And, it was from the Cheesecake era. So, some people today might object to the way the character was portrayed. But, again, I guess I'm older and I saw the fun in it and think it was a great run, for example. We really have a great conversation. Also, Danny talks a lot about learning how to edit from Larry Lieber, Stan Lee's brother. And I think Larry Lieber is one of those comic creators that easily gets overlooked because he's Stan's younger brother. But Larry was a very significant guy in comics history, and we mainly focused on his Marvel time. But you can't forget that, as Danny points out, Larry left Marvel for a moment and stuck with Martin Goodman when Martin brought back Atlas Comics in the 70s. And Larry was a key editor for Atlas during that time. Larry continues to draw the Spider-Man comic strip that is written by Stan and inked by my buddy Alex Saviuk, another guy who was part of the Clone Saga, one of the artists. And, so it's really great to get a point of view from Danny on Larry Lieber. I also asked him about the relationship between Stan Lee and Will Eisner, because I think a lot of current comic fans will read a book like the Eisner-Miller book that Dark Horse put out, which was the series of conversations that Eisner and Miller had. And I felt like maybe Will was kind of giving a backhanded kind of insult to Stan, calling him more of a promoter than regarding him at all as a writer. And Danny gives us his observations because he knew both men. Danny is involved with Will Eisner Week, which is a very important national comic book celebration of the great man. And we talk a bit about that. Really interesting guy. Really glad I got to talk to him. Looking forward to seeing him at Wizard World Chicago. And I hope he'll come back because I really enjoyed this conversation with Danny Fingeroff. And I think you will too. Today's Word Balloon is brought to you again by the League of Word Balloon listeners. Thank you, League, for your support. Fresh from San Diego, and one of the reasons why is because subscribers to Word Balloon are willing to give me $1 or more a month and help me out with the plane tickets and the accommodations and equipment, and helps me network with these great creators and bring you new people and also panels from conventions. And it's in a big part because of the League of Word Balloon listeners. There have been more people that have recently started subscribing to Word Balloon via Patreon, and I thank you for that. It really does help, and I do appreciate it. Word Balloon is free. It will always be free. But if you want to help the cause, come to wordballoon.com. Click on the Patreon button there, or go to patreon.com/wordballoon. And if you can afford $1 a month even, I mean, or $3 a month, the price of a comic book. Do you think the conversations I have here at Word Balloon Monthly are worth the price of a comic book? I think we're bringing unique content, both me and the guests, that you don't find anywhere else, and that includes other podcasts as well. So if you like what you hear and you think it's worthwhile, just like you think your favorite book is worthwhile, if you can spare $1 or $2 a month, that'd be terrific. You can go to wordballoon.com and click on the Patreon button there, or patreon.com/wordballoon, and learn all about subscribing to Word Balloon. So thank you again, League of Word Balloon listeners. Word Balloon is also brought to you by In Stock Trades at instocktrades.com. Lots of cool indie books are starting to pop up now at In Stock Trades. Things like Slash and Burn from Cy Spencer and Max Dunbar. This is a very cool action book, and it is 45% off, just $8.24. You can get Deadly Class, Volume 4, Die For Me. Rick Remender and Wesley Craig continue to entertain with this very fine series. And, man, it's been a while since I've had Rick on, and I apologize because I love Rick. And, if I were doing this every day, I'm sure Rick would be on a hell of a lot more. But he'll be coming back soon in the months ahead. But check out Deadly Class Volume 4, 42% off. It's just $8.69. You can also get Uncanny Inhumans, trade paperback, Volume 2, The Quiet Room, Charles Soule, another guy that I got to get back on Word Balloon. It's been far too long. Brandon Peterson doing the art chores. Great stuff. 45% off, $9.89. You can get The Killing Joke is now, man, they always find a way to repurpose this fine book. You can get it now in black and white at 50% off. The wonderful book by Alan Moore and Brian Boland, now a animated film, $12.49 for the Batman Noir version of The Killing Joke. So just a few of the great deals that are happening now at InStockTrades.com. Check them out for yourself. Go to InStockTrades.com. Okay, let's get our conversation going with Danny Fingeroff. It's a lot of fun. I think it's pretty funny. And like I said, I think initially he's like, hey, man, you just said hello and you immediately want to talk about the Clone Saga? No. And I think I proved that, no, I want to talk about your whole career. So this was terrific, honestly, and it's a long time coming because I'm a huge fan of the gentleman, not only through his comic book writing, but his examination of the comic field. That's another thing that we talk about. He's written a lot of great books, including Superman on the Couch, which are very thoughtful analyses of comic books and superheroes and their place in society, how we react to them as readers. And this is just a very thoughtful guy. Plus, I think because of his experience and when he worked, gives us a very different perspective on breaking into comics when he did compared to the way it is today. And I think it explains the catching up that I think a lot of comic book professionals needed to do in addressing today's audience, because a lot of them really came in literally when the majority of people in comics thought that it was dying. And, eventually these guys were going to have to find other jobs. I mean, I've heard that from people like Frank Miller and others of the late 70s, early 80s that were getting into comics. And it's like, what the hell are you doing here? Even Neil Adams back in the 60s was told the same thing. What are you doing in this business? It's dying. Don't you see what's happening here? So it was a very different perspective than today's industry, where DC and Marvel is kind of, as I've said before, part of the ride before you can maybe graduate to being a creator-owned comic creator that can live off your books and do it full-time. So interesting conversation with Danny Fingeroff. Happy to bring it to you right now on Word Balloon. Danny Fingeroff, welcome to Word Balloon. As we were saying off the air, we've met in passing, but it's nice to finally have a conversation with you.
Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me on.
Man, I'll tell you, a longtime fan. Although, interestingly enough, and forgive me, but the heart of your career at Marvel, it seems, at least as far as editing, that's kind of when I checked out of comics, like during the Clone Saga and all that stuff. And I wasn't back until 99.
Well, you missed a lot of good stuff. Wow, I thought it would take at least 10 minutes for us to get to the Clone Saga, but that is a long, complicated story that I've told way too many times. But are you sick of talking about it? No, I can always talk about it. I'm sure most of your audience might even have been born during that period. So, You know? But maybe if you could, maybe we could have it in the form of a question, it would be less rambly,
No worries, man. No, and honestly, I am fascinated by it. I read the original, of course, Jackal story back, Jerry Conway's story in the early 70s. I think I got the Marvel Tales version.
Right.
I don't think I caught the first run.
So the Marvel Tales, depending on when it came out, might have had panels and pages cut out to fit into the probably 17 pages.
Interesting. You see that, and I know, and here we go. We'll start at your beginnings because you started as an associate editor and working for Marvel's British product, right?
You've done your homework. Yeah, I was an assistant editor / traffic manager in what was called the British department. I worked for Larry Lieber, who, of course, is Stan Lee's brother. Mm-hmm. Larry had come back from, he'd been at Marvel for his whole career. Then he had a couple of years at a company called Atlas, which was started by Martin Goodman, who had also started Marvel. That's yet another complicated story. But I was working. Yes, I worked as Larry's assistant, doing mostly reprint material. But we would do new covers, new splash pages, would sort of recap previous issue. The British comics had these stories broken up into shorter chapters to compete with what we perceived as the weekly market of British black and white comics. Things like 2000 AD, Beano, I forget some of the other titles, but Marvel produced the material in New York, including, as I say, mostly it was reprint material in black and white, but there was some Captain Britain material. That's where Captain Britain first appeared, was appropriately enough in British Marvel. So, and who better to put together Captain Marvel than a bunch of guys from the Bronx and Brooklyn? I blew the whole line. Who better to put together Captain Britain than a bunch of guys from the Bronx and Brooklyn? So
absolutely. Well, I even remember the original design and reading Tomorrow's magazines and stuff that that was more the Scottish flag, wasn't it? Rather than the Union Jack that he eventually had, his original uniform was like, hey, what are you doing? Scottish flag.
I wish I could say I did that much research, but you're probably right.
Well, did you help design?
No. I came in. It was already underway.
Okay.
But I mean, I do remember. Think back to the dark, distant past before the internet. And there was a story that called for Nelson's Monument, which is one of the most famous landmarks in London, and I actually had to go to what's called a library, kids, and go to the reference section. And they did have photocopy machines, so I think I was able to make a photocopy. I didn't have to take a giant piece of silly putty and stick it on the page and then peel off a reverse image. I was able to. So there was actual research involved. My favorite, kind of wacky anecdote from Captain Britain was there was a 2-part story drawn by 2 different artists. So, of course, neither one saw what the other was doing. And there was a cliffhanger involving a Gila monster, which I've never, I've seen photos, but I never knew until the story I'm about to tell you what size they were. The word monster is in their name, but I don't think they're, they're maybe a couple of feet long, and I could be wrong, but they're certainly not like 12 feet long. They're not monsters in those sense, but in that sense, but. One of the artists read it and saw the word monster, and so drew it like it was 12 feet long. And which, and aside from the fact that I don't think that's anything like reality, it's also different than the artist in the previous issue had drawn it. So.
Was he like a normal lizard size?
Yeah, normal lizard size. Yeah, but it was only shown in 1 or 2 panels in the previous issue, and the perspective was a little confusing. So he could have been any size, and I think Larry was on vacation, and this was probably my first major editorial decision made independently. Larry was on vacation, and I was filling in, and I thought, well, just all I thought I was doing was proofreading the story, and then. Somebody pointed out, or maybe even I realized, that a Gila monster was not 12 feet long. So rather than having the story redrawn, I just called it a giant mutant Gila monster. And I don't know if we got any letters complaining. So yeah, I did that
That's
for
awesome.
about a year and a half, and then eventually a guy named Des Skin came along. If you know that name, he was
I do.
yeah. So Des.
Well, yeah, and no, honestly, shame on me, man, because listeners might not know, but Des Skin was a very important British writer-editor, correct?
And publisher also.
And publisher, yeah, and published the original The Return of Marvel Man, Miracle Man.
Right, that's true. And in the 70s, he was the British publisher of Mad Magazine and some other well-known.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
that's really cool. Okay,
I don't know what that meant. I think I don't know if I ever saw the Mads, but I think they probably reformatted it for a British audience and changed the spelling of like we did, change the spelling of color to color and stuff. The ironic thing, we'd do that. We would change the spellings and try to make the localized things, but the funny thing was, the real fans, say these were aimed at, kids 6, 7, 8, 9 years old. So I don't know if they were that discerning as fans, but the real fans wanted the actual American comics. They sort of saw the reprints as, as an inferior alternative to having the real comics. So Des came over, and eventually somebody at Marvel thought, gee, an actual British person, maybe he should be doing the British comic. They had a British office. It was me and Larry and a small bullpen doing paste ups and art corrections in New York, and then we had our counterparts in England, one of whom was Neil Tennant, who went on to be Neil Tennant of the Pet Shop Boys.
Hilarious! Yeah. Wow, because I know Richard Starkings worked in Marvel's British office as well.
I think so. Not. I don't think in the time when I was involved with it. Paul Neary, Des Skin, Paul Neary were the names people might know.
Yeah.
Paul is known mostly as an inker, but as an excellent penciler and writer as well. And
very cool.
Yeah. So anyway, moving right along. What else?
No, that was a good story.
What else has your research discovered?
Well, no, I wanted to. Well, also you had a nice run on Dazzler, which is interesting.
That's true.
Tell me about writing Dazzler.
She was very clean. She took more baths than just about any, and showers than just about any other hero. Dazzler was an interesting phenomenon. The origin of the character. Before I was involved, was she was supposed to be a joint venture with Casablanca Records, which was a big disco label, and she was going to be maybe.
That's interesting. Wait a minute, Marvel had an actual deal with Casablanca because, as you say, really big label in that late 70s period and even early 80s. It really was that, like, almost if people saw Boogie Nights, like the record company version of that story in terms of what was going on over there and everything, too.
It sounds like you know a lot more about it than I do. I mean, I know there was a guy named Neil Bogart who was running it, hence he called the place Casablanca, Well, Marvel, I think from its very beginnings, I mean, even from the 30s and 40s, was making crossover deals with other media companies. So the idea was that there would be, I think Gloria Gaynor, I couldn't swear to that, but there was some disco diva who was going to be the Dazzler in a movie and live appearances. I think there was actually just in one of the maybe in Michael Urie's back issue magazine, in the latest issue, I think there's a big article about the Dazzler.
Oh, man, I'm going to think, you see, San Diego's coming up, and that's when I catch up on all my Tomorrow's magazine. Yeah. And we're going to get to your Tomorrow's history as well.
But the Dazzler was a phenomenon. Eventually it was going to be Bo Derek for a while. There was going to be a movie.
Hilarious.
And then eventually all those deals fell through, and Marvel had this comic it had put together, so we decided to go ahead with it. I was the assistant editor on it to Louise Simonson when it first started, and then because I'd moved to the British department to go on to England, and I had a couple of other editorial jobs, and at a certain point became Louise, you may know her as Louise Simonson. She was called Louise Jones back then. She'd come over from Warren magazines, where she was editing Eerie, Creepy, and Vampirella.
Yeah.
And so she would be a natural for the Dazzler. But we had this incredible, and she was. We had this incredible. The editor back then. The editors had an unbelievable workload. We had the Dazzler and the X-Men books and the Conan books and Man-Thing and Star Trek and Star Wars. I mean, we must have put out 12 or 15 comics a month just from our office. Anyway, so Dazzler, I was assistant editor. Then there was kind of a personnel shakeup, and when the pieces landed, I was writing it, and Jim Shooter was editing it, and it was a certainly immersive introduction to writing a monthly comic. Having plot conferences with Jim and with Frank Springer, and learning what it meant to not only to do a monthly comic, but to do one that nobody took seriously. I mean, it's sort of, it simultaneously was less pressure and more pressure, because on the one hand, everybody thought the Dazzler was a silly idea, because in some ways it was. And so on the one hand, if it was bad, people would go, well, it's the Dazzler, what do you expect, And if it was good, people would be pleasantly surprised.
Sure.
But it definitely was sort of a little bit more under a microscope, and it somehow came through that the comic didn't need to have her taking, a lot of showers and stuff. I mean, that was sort of an era when that was
kind of a cheesecake kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. That's what I mean. Kind of a cheesecake thing. Within the context. I mean, she did fight, Galactus and Terrax and. I think we did a credible job of making you believe that it was remotely possible she could do that. But it was a real baptism by fire. It's not like somebody said, well, here, write a couple of issues of Iron Man, or write a couple of issues of
Shang-Chi.
Shang-Chi, right? It's not like somebody said, here's sort of a or Man-Thing, or which are a lot of those are things I worked on as an assistant editor or as an editor.
Cool.
Comics is great because you learn while you earn. You kind of, but Dazzler had, it was an idea that a lot of people thought was goofy. So there's a lot of attention paid to it, and so it was fun to do. I mean, I welcomed the chance to write a monthly title, to show what I could do to earn extra money, which was, as opposed to today, where I think there's almost no staffers at Marvel or DC who also do freelance work. I mean, it's sort of looked at as as inappropriate or something, that
double dipping, basically, yeah.
Yes, and yet some of the greatest comics ever done have been done by people doing just that. No,
I understand. Please.
But I mean, I get the ethical, the potential ethical dilemma with it. But not only was it allowed, it was expected that you would do that in those days. It was
sure.
It was a way to see if you, did want to eventually become a freelancer. It was a way that you would, for editors to really understand what it was like on the other side of the desk to be a freelancer and what that meant. And honestly, editorial salaries were so terrible. The only way you could survive, especially in an expensive city like New York, was to have, in effect, a second job. I mean, what had been fairly common, this is something that ended, that Jim Shooter prohibited, and I think that, because that was a weird thing where there would be editors at Marvel or editors at DC doing freelance for the other company.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that was just seen as, you got to do what you got to do to make a living, that. But when you think about it, I mean, it speaks also to the sort of insulated nature of the industry and how. It's such a different comics world, in the 70s and 80s, but that was seen, I think that's seen, as okay for people to work for one company versus the other. I don't know if there's any, to be it's one thing for a freelancer to work for two companies. That's the definition
Sure.
of being a freelancer.
Of course.
But to have a staff job somewhere and then do freelance for the competition does seem, it's just one of those debates that could, if your company is tiny and you're writing and editing, then it's almost you're fulfilling every role anyway.
Yeah, Matt Hawkins at Top Cow right now is writing a good portion of their books, and is like, yeah, we're a tight shop. I'm sorry,
right?
I got to do it.
A guy named Stan Lee did that too. It worked out pretty well,
No, and seriously, man, absolutely,
yeah.
and I really appreciate like the backstory of that period, because it was just accepted. Also, and this is something I've heard, and maybe you heard the same thing, in terms of newcomers would walk in the door, and it's like the old timers would be like, "What are you doing here, man? This is a dying medium.
Oh, totally.
We're going to be out of work next year or whatever." So if there's that kind of mentality going on as well,
that's true. Definitely that's part of it. It was comics was, say late 70s, mid-late 70s, early 80s. The attitude, look, as an art form, of course, it's never going away because people will express themselves,
sure,
whether they make any money at it or not. But as far as
newspaper strips weren't having the problem that comic books were, but go on.
The problem, the comics, really, we looked at it like, well, here's this quaint folk art, this quaint American folk craft, and let's enjoy it while we can. And then the last one out, turn the lights out. It really, and it wasn't even like, the way I just said it really sounds kind of depressing and fatalistic, but it was just like, it was pretty much as axiomatic as saying, the sun's going to go down and then it'll come up tomorrow. So, that's just how things are. I think probably there was knowledge, again, not, I think people always knew that whoever owned the rights to the intellectual property known as Superman or the intellectual property known as Spider-Man had something of value that people would be interested in paying money to see various versions of, but not necessarily in a floppy comic book.
Right. I'm doing a panel at San Diego about comic book and strip inspired films, but I'm even expanding it to radio and really just that golden age of Hollywood period, to point out that as great as things are right now, it isn't new,
mm-hmm.
and that a lot of these comic book and strip properties were being exploited in the other media, as you say. And I mean, radio and film and ones that you don't, automatically think of. But that's just part of my presentation. But yeah, I mean, it's, Archie had a radio show for over a decade. It's just crazy stuff, like a weekly, sitcom. And, Jerry Lewis made Sad Sack.
Right.
Certainly.
So that's interesting. You did. Well, I think Sad Sack must have been maybe you've done some research more than I have. I think it was just a military term, or just a term for,
well, but it was actually based on the comic strip.
Really? So it wasn't just called the Sad Sack as an expression. It was based on the strip. That's very interesting.
Absolutely. Oh yeah, it's in the credits and everything.
Oh, next time I see it, I'll have to look for that in the credits. It's very interesting. But I mean, say today, you ask. I mean, this is sort of one of the premises of my book, Superman on the Couch, that everybody knows these characters. Everybody knows the Hulk. Everybody knows the Hulk is Bruce Banner, and he wouldn't like me when I'm angry. And everybody knows my spider sense is tingling, and that Spider-Man's Peter Parker, and that Superman is Clark Kent, and Batman's Bruce Wayne. These are all certainly American, and in many cases world mythology that people know. But even now, with circulation healthier than it's been for a long time, most people don't know that from the comic books. They know them as these intellectual properties that appear in movies, television, video games. So So those are two. There are a lot of different factors in what we generally call the comics business by which success is measured. So Marvel and DC certainly say whoever owns those properties. I think even in the 70s they must have realized that there will always be a some kind of interest in those characters. They were now we're in the era of the maximum interest in and exploitation of those properties.
Who owned Marvel back when you started?
Marvel was owned by Cadence Industries, which was the people who had bought it from Martin Goodman. They were, I think, originally they were called Perfect Film and Chemical, and they were a classic kind of. I'm sure somebody who's an actual economist listening to this will tell you what I'm about to get wrong, but it was a classic kind of 60s and 70s hodgepodge conglomerate. They had, maybe a dozen. Cadence owned ultimately like a dozen different companies, most of which had very little to do with one another. I mean, there was Marvel. There was Magazine Management, which had been Martin Goodman's publishing company for non-comics magazines, which was
Men's Adventure,
which was a much larger part of his business than the comics was for a long time. So there was Magazine Management. There was a company that made pens and pencils called U.S. Pen and Pencil. There was a chain of movie theaters. So it wasn't. If there was any governing philosophy aside from we think these things will be making money, there was no, there seemed to be no thematic, but that was a very common thing. So ultimately, Cadence then became just Marvel, and then it went through various changes of ownership over the years. Yeah, when I went there, it was Cadence Industries.
Oh, okay. And I didn't know if you worked for them when they were New World or.
Yeah. Well, anything.
And certainly.
Yeah, New World.
Yeah, certainly in the 90s.
That it was. Right. Everybody knows that Marvel now is owned by Disney, and we have the internet, so there's constant. You hear constant chatter. What does it mean that Marvel's owned by Disney? Has it helped them? Has it hurt them? What are they allowed to do? What aren't they allowed to do? I think when the company changed hands, for a certain time, the main way it affected us would be we'd have a different health insurance company. It would be like,
sure.
Now you're owned by New World, so your insurance is with, Blue Cross instead of with Oxford or vice versa. I mean,
sure.
It didn't. I'm sure there were, and how now being more aware of stuff going on behind the scenes. I certainly am aware of how corporate politics and philosophies affected what we were doing, but as far as we were concerned in editorial and in creative, it was really just the good and bad news was that the various editors-in-chief did a very good job of shielding their staffs from that kind of thing. There was a feeling of continuity that, in retrospect, was probably an illusion. Nothing.
Business as usual, basically.
Yeah, which was a good thing until there was a certain point during the era when it was owned by the Ronald Perlman organization, where the two realities tended to merge and blur, and we saw how we were directly impacted by corporate decisions made. That was a different era. That was, and it was during that era that I felt it necessary to leave. Things had gotten a little unpleasant there. That's when I went to work for Byron Price. We probably skipped about 20 years here. So if you want to go back,
no, but I am interested. And forgive me if it's painful to remember or talk about. But yeah, I mean, I just do think two things. One, in that early 80s period when New World owned them, there was kind of this moment where Marvel was kind of spitting out those movies, Dolph Lundgren Punisher and well, certainly, in the 70s, they had the TV movies and the television success of Spider-Man, but more importantly, the Hulk, obviously, into the early 80s. But then, there just seemed to be that period, and I wondered how much that impacted the comic side. And then, as you say, the 90s, I am interested in, I mean, again, I don't.
Well, as long as you don't have any preconceived notions about it going in, I mean, I've had basically as far as I could tell, and again, I was certainly in my early years, I was not privy to like high level executive decisions, but it seemed to me the only real effect, on the books that the Hulk TV show had was we put a blurb on the cover going, "As seen in the hit TV show." That was pretty much, and then they put and then they put out a couple of extra Hulk comics to try to capitalize on that. But I think that if you look at it now as a comics person, you could look at what's happening now as the tail wagging the dog, right? I mean, although again, that's something that's been true through the history of comics, even from the very beginning. A lot of things we think of as as part of, say, the Superman mythos comes from the Superman radio show, Jimmy Olsen, and a couple of other ongoing characters. So I mean, again, I think just by the nature of the fact that more people listen to more people watch a single episode of a show than read 10 years worth of a comics title, means that appropriately the two media should certainly be matching, so that somebody goes from one to the other, they won't be mystified and go, "This is not the thing I saw on TV. Why should I?" That's another eternal struggle in comics, to sort of try to keep the comics consistent without quote unquote selling out, or whatever you want to call it, to the more popular medium. It just makes sense. Something's working, people know it. I mean, look, I get this question all the time, even today, from people: why do Marvel and DC still put out comics compared to what the movies and TV shows and video games and underoos and and apparel and everything else makes? Why do they even bother with the comics? And I have my own theories, but on the other hand, if either company said tomorrow, "We're not publishing comics anymore because they're just like a small part of our business," I wouldn't be shocked. I think that comics still, even in the age of the internet, or especially in the age of the internet, still make an awful lot of money. So it's still a viable business. I think it's why they still do it, and I think it is research and development for the movies and TV shows. But I would not be shocked. I mean, if one of both companies said, "All right, everybody knows our characters, and so thank you very much, comics, and we'll see you later," right?
Yeah, but don't you think they would? Because Marty Pasco and I had this conversation, and he just brought it up, and I didn't even consider that. But he's like, well, if that were to happen, don't you think like an IDW would go to Warner Brothers then and say, we'd like to license Batman and Superman and keep making comics. We'll make them.
Probably. I mean, again, that would not surprise me. So much of it has to do with sort of the editorial philosophy. It's like if all the companies wanted, right? If somebody, right? If the philosophy or the thinking was, yes, look, and here's free money. If you want to print our comics and pay us to do it, why not? On the other hand, if there's somebody who says, "Gee, look, it's diluting our brand," or it's going to take sales away from our movies. One thing that comics is famous for is not doing any market research. Almost, I'd say almost every decision you've ever seen in a comic is based, on sales and intuition. So I mean, you go, okay, this sold. We think we know why. But wait, we have to actually spend money to like inquire and do a research about why people did or didn't buy something. Forget that,
So, Cunningham, DC did that retailer and reader survey a couple of years ago, and I don't know how scientific
that's true. I was being a little facetious. I mean, they do occasionally, but they certainly don't.
Frank, you're right about the old days.
Yeah.
It certainly seemed like it was just sticking your finger up in the air and seeing which way the wind was blowing. Absolutely.
Well, basically, in the old days, no matter what the question was, the answer was always gorillas. That was pretty much.
Put a gorilla in the cover.
Yeah, that was the solution to any problem in comics. Yeah, put a gorilla on the cover. That's right.
You're right. That's fantastic. Man.
Well, but from what I've read that, and I think an interview, with people, Donenfeld, not Harry, the son, Irwin Donenfeld. Irwin Donenfeld, did, and I'm sure Goodman did it too. They had, books where they would have, each cover, and then what the sales were. They didn't get they couldn't get the full sales figures for close to 6 months. So you would track what was on that, and there was no such thing as as any kind of fan-oriented preview. So the assumption was people were buying each comic based on what was on the cover. And so that's where the gorillas theory came from, because every time there's a gorilla that seemed to have like a human mind trapped in it, I don't think it was just gorillas. It was something where there'd be a human trapped inside an ape body or something like that. But that was, I think that's where sometimes there were like famous dictates in comics. Always use green. Never use green. Right? That was based on that. But there was no. So yeah, I think you're right. I'm sure that over the years there have been various surveys. But as a general rule, comics, the companies did not spend money on demographic or market research. So they just sort of fly by the seat of their pants. And if somebody had a successful track record as an editor or a publisher, then sort of they were looked at as having a certain kind of wisdom.
Were you a fan of? I'm sorry.
No. Go on. Was it a fan of what?
Were you a fan of Marvel Comics growing up, and was it this like a dream job getting to work for them and everything?
I was a big fan. I was the perfect age to have been feel like I was getting jaded. I was reading. I was a big superhero fan. I was a comics fan in general, especially superhero fan in the early, late 50s, early 60s.
Okay.
And I've been reading them long enough to start without realizing it, feeling jaded with the DC comics. With here's yet another story of Lois trying to find out Superman's secret identity. I dug them. Sort of. I was certainly buying them and enjoying them. And then a friend of mine said, a fellow comic fan, a friend of mine said, there's this thing called Fantastic Four you should check out. So I went. The first issue I bought was issue number 4, The Return of the Submariner. And,
nice.
And it filled, it suddenly filled an entertainment and a storytelling need that I didn't know I had. I was like, boy, these are different. They're more like people I really know. And as I was getting older, and so I was ready for those Marvel comics, and I didn't even know that I didn't know I was, but there were a lot of people who got into the business around the time I did, who within a year or two were the same age as me. People who were baby boomers, born.
Yeah, give us some names of your peers.
Huh?
Give me some names of your peers.
Mark Gruenwald, Ralph Macchio, who else? Bob Budiansky, Tom DeFalco, a couple of years older, but basically the same ballpark. Jim Shooter. Those are my people born within a couple of years of when I was.
Sure.
So and so I think we all. Suddenly this thing came along, this approach to comics that was pretty amazing. And a thing that people forget or never knew. I think Marvel and DC were printed by the same companies, and yet if you look at them side by side, the printing on the Marvel comics of the early 60s was really crappy, where colors would blob up or they'd be off register, and they almost became three-dimensional. I mean, there was something a little that looked a little bad for you about them. That looked a little suspect. It's like, even by comic book standards of printing quality, which are pretty low, they looked dangerous and intriguing. So I mean, you can read. I mean, it's I sometimes see the very fancy reprints on the glossy paper with the airbrushed modern coloring, and I go, well, that's nice, but there's something about being 9, 10, 11 years old, and this really like visceral product is in your hand, and so of course the stories and the art were very powerful, but there was something about that cheap printing that was just appropriate and felt cut. It shouldn't have. It should have felt like, well, I'm looking at like some, they probably are printing these, in the middle of the night for, 30% off or something. But it just felt three-dimensional. You've seen some of those original books, haven't you?
I know exactly what you're talking about. Yes, and again, those artists as well, Kirby and Ditko, had that pulpy feel to them.
They did, and it was. Yeah, it was. So I mean, obviously, I couldn't have articulated this when I was a kid, but there was. Yeah, so I was a big fan of Marvel. I would say my dream future was to be Jack Kirby. I mean, I don't know if I saw it as a industry, business, career, job. I was like, I want to be that guy, who I'd never met or heard or read much about. I wanted to be the guy that drew that stuff. And then then I went through, sort of a classic kind of abandoning of comics in adolescence, but then rediscovering them through the undergrounds and through really a lot through the Jim Warren's reprints of The Spirit, and The Spirit, was a big entry point for me back in. So
that's great. On that peach-colored paper.
Oh yeah. Well, no Warren. Oh, but the black and white ones, right?
Yeah, but I just mean the paper that he used, and maybe it just colored. Maybe
that was aging. It wasn't peach colored originally.
Okay, because I have bought some, and I guess you're right. I do remember.
I think what you're thinking of is the color inserts turned a little peach colored.
Maybe that is it, but you're right. The color inserts were amazing too. Yeah. But no, I was getting those in Creepy and Eerie.
Right.
And you're right; those were like Dangerous Comics and stuff.
Those are great.
And I was 12 when I was getting that stuff. So yeah.
All right. So I'm a little bit older than you, but not that much. So the
70s, born in '64.
And what was I going to say? So the Spirit was very intriguing, and just one of my clients today is I'm a regular consultant to the Will Eisner Studios and Will and Ann Eisner Family Foundation. So I do a lot of work for and with them, especially on Will Eisner Week, which is an annual series of events around Will Eisner's March 6th birthday.
That's yes. If we haven't talked about it, Diana Schutz and I were talking about
sure.
it. And I know in Portland that's like a real week-long event, and I'm sure in New York as well.
Well, I not to pat myself on the back too much, but it's a series of events that used to be like 3 or 4 events around the country, and now it's 75 or more events worldwide. And
that's fantastic.
That was what I was brought on to expand the reach of Will Eisner Week, and part of which I do is just by being very annoying, just by constantly calling and emailing people and going, are you going to do something for Will Eisner Week this year? Or what do you think? Maybe you'll do something for Will Eisner Week? How about doing something for Will Eisner Week? It would be great if you did something for Will Eisner Week. That would be really swell. So through my creative nagging and annoying, I've managed to help them, and then to develop some momentum of its own, whether it be libraries or comic shops or schools that want to do something. And Boy, we just jumped ahead like 20 years again, or more, like 30.
Yeah, but these are good rambles. No, honestly, like my audience loves it when a tangent happens.
So Eisner was a big, and again, I was the perfect age for Jules Feiffer's The Great Comic Book Heroes, which was what really introduced Eisner to my generation. He had a spirit.
Understood. Yes.
He had a spirit story in that book. It was the holiday gift of 1965. If you were a comic fan, that was what you were getting for the holidays.
That's awesome because like 8 years later, in those early 70s, for me the It books were those Fireside Origins comics, and then also from DC, all those Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman and Shazam from the 30s to the 70s collections.
Well, and don't forget the Steranko history of the comics. Those were eye openers. A lot of it is sort of history we've seen recounted again and again. Especially with the internet, you can find a lot of this stuff. But that two-parter Steranko did, including a very long interview with Eisner. Who was the grand old man of comics. If you calculate his age, he was like 55 then. But he was the grand old man, which can happen in a business where people start out in their teens, right? If you start in your teens and you're 55, you've been in the business for 40 years, so.
Absolutely.
But Eisner, Eisner's history, and I'm sure many of your listeners do, that he had been in the business, at its beginnings, and then got out very wisely just before the whole Wortham thing happened in the 50s, and spent 25 years doing educational and corporate comics, and then came back, of course, in the 70s with Contract with God. But he never stopped doing comics. He was always, drawing and writing and doing a million different projects. I have some interesting correspondence between him and Stan in the book I did with Roy Thomas, The Stanley Universe, a Tomorrow's publication, which I highly recommend. So yeah, Eisner was a big part. So I came to. I studied filmmaking at Binghamton University in upstate New York, and came back home after college, which to me was, I grew up in New York, so I came home to New York, sort of trying to figure out what I was going to do, and I thought, it might be fun to work at Marvel Comics for a few months while I figure out what I'm, really going to do. And I didn't have any direct connections, but I had an indirect connection to get in for an informational interview, which led to me getting that entry-level job working with Larry in the British department. And then needless to say, it turned out to be more than just something to do for a few months. It seemed it was a good fit, and it fulfilled. It fulfilled a need that I had to do something that was both practical but creative. It was, you could, look at that, they will pay me money to make comic books. That's a pretty, that beats a poke in the eye with a sharp stick. So I actually had to catch up on a lot of the continuity and the storyline, but sort of, I guess maybe around the time that Kirby went to DC, and somewhere during the Fourth World tenure of Kirby at DC, I sort of, I said my interest drifted. I went towards the undergrounds and independence and towards movies, and I always had a fondness for comics. And American Splendor was a big thing for me also when that came out.
Cool.
That captivated me and kind of reminded me of what comics could do. And Art Spiegelman was involved. One of my teachers was a guy named Ken Jacobs, who was also Art Spiegelman's mentor and a very influential teacher. So Spiegelman, I remember, came up and spoke at my school one time, and so it just seemed like comics kept intersecting with my other interests. So that I ended up in a medium that combined words and pictures is not surprising to me or anybody who knows me.
I got to pick up on this because you say you had you have letters between Eisner and Stan Lee.
Right.
I read the Eisner Frank Miller conversation book in Dark Horse.
Right.
And Frank asks Eisner his opinion of Stan. And he it seemed like it was a bit of a that he had to kind of find the right words and said, well, Stan was a hell of a promoter. I just wonder if those letters gave you, and your own experiences with either men or both men, gave you an idea of how they felt about each other.
There's you can actually find this online, although, I'm not sure if it's pirated or not, but it's on YouTube. So there was a series that Stan did in the early 90s called The Comic Book Greats, a series of DVDs. And I haven't looked for, I own the DVDs, but last I looked, they were also, there's one of him and Eisner.
Oh, I didn't know that. Go on, please, because I've seen the ones with Liefeld and Jim Lee. Go on. And Johnny, Romita Jr.
Oh, the one with him and Eisner is awesome. I mean, it's, look, I although I do actually have a copy of Eisner Miller, like I'm touching it right now, but I'm not going to open it and try to confirm or refute. This is a classic. I felt a need. I didn't feel like it just. Here I am. I'm watching myself going. I actually turned around and touched the book, like I had to prove to you on an on an audio medium that I actually had the book here. But
I appreciate the effort.
I appreciate the appreciation. Look, I think. I met Eisner a few times, so I can't claim to. I'm an expert on his work and on his interviews. And he gave me a wonderful interview we did a couple of years before he passed away. That I did for Right Now magazine. That gets reprinted quite a bit. So Will Eisner was very nice to me. He gave me a blurb, despite not liking superheroes. He gave me a very nice blurb for Superman on the Couch. So I knew him a little, but I can't. But I would say he and Stan, I sensed in that if you go look at that interview, so the comic book greats was Stan actually being a host, interviewing various comic book creators of his generation and of the more modern generation. This was in the early 90s. So as you say, Liefeld and McFarlane and Jim Lee. I felt a great mutual affection and respect and admiration in the one that Stan and Will. Maybe Will felt almost some pressure to say that thing about Stan being a promoter and not anything about the work. Also, I think Will, never made any secret if he didn't really like superheroes. Even the Spirit was only by the most liberal
gloves and domino mask.
Liberal definition of superhero. Will's famous story is that he had done sort of this two-fisted detective character, and then the syndicate, the representative of the syndicate that was going to publish it said, "Is he a superhero? Does he have a costume?" And that's when Will drew the mask and the gloves. And I guess the medium was new enough. The genre was new enough then that was, that they, I think the Register and Tribune Syndicate it was called, said, okay, I guess he's a superhero. He's got a mask and gloves.
Sure.
So I think Will and Stan were personally fond of each other. I think Will admired what Stan did, but since the bulk of what Stan became known for was superheroes, and Will didn't like superheroes, maybe it was hard for him. Now I'm just sort of conjecturing, and I don't know. But if you read the letters, Stan at one point did offer Will the opportunity to be the editor-in-chief of Marvel, and they had a meeting about it, and I think Will realized he was never. I think Will was happy to have lunch with Stan and chat with him about it, but I don't think he ever saw that as where, and as evidenced by, the contract with God and the next 30 years of Will's career until, he died, not literally with a pencil in his hand, but pretty close. I think you can see his interests were in a whole other direction. But, they were both products of the same background, both Bronx Jewish kids who went to DeWitt Clinton High School, which is where DeWitt Clinton High School was like kind of the Harvard, Yale, and Oxford of comics. That was.
Yeah, go through the alums, absolutely.
Bob Kane, Stan Lee, Bill Finger, Erwin Hazen. I I know I'm forgetting like a half dozen others, and not just in comics, like in every field. I mean, Lerner and Lowe, Rogers and Hammerstein.
Wow. Yeah. Holy shit. Yeah.
Dan Shore, who was famous as a CBS and NPR news guy. So,
yes,
so I always detected a great fondness and mutual respect between Stan and Will. So I don't know what the quote.
Well, it actually was in context of the offer to come over and be an editor.
Oh, right.
And I wasn't sure. And hey, honestly, I am not one of those Kirby over Lee guys.
Mm-hmm.
Steranko was at a Chicago art show, and at the time, those Just Imagine Stan Lee comics from DC were coming out.
Right.
And someone's like, not too good. And he's like, since 1940, Stan's written like 10,000 comic stories from, Captain America and the Destroyer to Millie the Model. And he's like, every genre, funny animals, westerns, you name it, Stan did stories. He's like, it's okay if, he's hitting the bottom of the ketchup bottle to squeeze out the last stories or whatever.
Yeah, I think those stories were a mixed bag. I think some were better than others.
Sure. Kubert I like the Batman one that Kubert and he did.
Yeah.
I thought that was really interesting, actually. And actually, another guy, because you have this perspective, and really, I wanted to get into Stan in terms of, you've had a close relationship with Stan over the years.
Yes and no. I wouldn't say that we're like drinking buddies, but yes, I've been. I have worked with him. Oddly enough, I think I worked with him more after I left Marvel at various companies than when I was at Marvel. But I did. Work with him from the time I worked with his brother in the British department in the 70s, and I edited him in the 80s on that Amazing Spider-Man annual with the Scorpion, which was a surreal thing to be doing, to be editing. To be like going.
So did he come to you with this? All right, this is what I want to do.
It was just the opposite. I mean, it was really it was a story plotted by DeFalco, and then Stan wrote the script, and most of it was. I could have printed it as it was, and nobody would have said anything or complained, because it was a terrific Stan Lee Spider-Man scripted story. But there were a few things in it that I thought didn't quite make sense. He decided to do it as a first-person narration, even though it was plotted, as with an omniscient narrator. So there was some stuff that it was. That it might have been impossible for Spider-Man to know, because he was, because he wasn't there, and that happens all the time in first-person narrative stories. So I think I had a couple of suggestions for him along those lines, and he might have been the most professional writer I ever worked with. If he agreed with me, he said, that's great, that improves it, thanks, thank you for thinking of that. If he disagreed, he made his case for why it should stay the way it was, or else come up with an alternative that was neither what he nor I had suggested. So, he never once said to me, I'm Stan Lee, just do it,
Sure, okay.
So that was pretty, that was very impressive that he took the pride in his work, he neither said, I'm Stan Lee, just do it, nor did he say, I've been paid, do whatever the hell you want, but he actually said, let's discuss how to make it into something that works and that we're both happy with, and again, there were maybe maybe there were 4 or 5 lines like that in the whole story, so it's not like, and then I worked with him when I was at Byron Preiss. I worked with him, on some comics based on a series of novels he did for Byron called Stan Lee's Rift World. And then I worked with him again when I was at a company called Visionary Media, and that was during the Stan Lee Media. So he's always fun to work with. He's always enthusiastic. I've actually, the past few years I've been working with Wizard, organizing and moderating 6 to 10 panels at all their shows. Mm-hmm. And for a while, Stan was a regular at the Marvel shows, and by his choice, I was very flattered and touched. I was his regular moderator at any shows we were at together, and that was actually a very nice, that was a very pleasant kind of bonding experience with him, and a way to spend sort of quality time in public with Stan. One of my favorite things, there was a panel in Sacramento a couple of years ago where he was under the weather. He'd had a flu shot and he was having a reaction to it. And so the president of Wizard World, came on before our panel, and he said, Stan's, he was supposed to be here yesterday, but he was under the weather from this flu shot reaction, but he's here today, but he's only going to do like a 20-minute panel. We don't want to strain him, so please, hope you'll understand. And, we're doing the panel, and Stan is fine and witty and, and insightful and all that and charming. And we get to, the 20-minute mark, and I say, well, Stan, as you know, we're going to make it a short panel because you're not feeling that well, and so do you have any, anything you want to say to the folks before we finish, because we have to stop? And he says to me, is God talking to you? Did he say we have to stop? I feel fine. Let's keep going. And, of course, everybody from Wizard and Stan's people are running around flashing me signals, which I have no idea what they mean, right? And so we did another 10 minutes. That's a classic Stan thing where, he's really energized by being in public and by the audiences at these things. So he's it's been really very an honor and gratifying to get to know him in that way. So and you could I could see, going back to that Eisner, that comic book greats thing he did with Will. I felt like they got a kick out of each other. That I don't know if I felt in every. I mean, Stan, all those interviews, if you've seen them, Stan certainly keeps his enthusiasm up. He's never.
Oh, yeah.
He's never anything but. A charming host. But with Will, you can, again, I don't know how close they were or weren't in real life. I know that Will, was for a time a regular contributor to Crazy magazine. Eisner had a lot, had sort of a very, there was a period where he was sort of doing a lot of different things on his way to finding his voice in the graphic novels and making that.
True.
His life's work for the last third of his life or so.
Absolutely, man. No. Now I'll switch subjects because I'm also interested because of the time you spent with Larry Lieber. We never hear about Larry Lieber, and I think he's a really important guy in comics. That because he's Stan's brother, gets that Tommy Aaron or. Trying to think of other,
Yeah, no, I know exactly, and that's, I don't.
Joe Negro and Phil Negro, Joe Negro.
Yeah. No, well, Larry is still drawing the Spider-Man strip.
And I'm glad you said that because I own two strips that they did together with also wonderful work from Alex Saviak. So yeah, man, no, and that's the thing. People don't realize that Larry's drawing the Spider-Man strip. That's amazing.
Right. Well, look, if you have a sibling, I don't want to go into. It's not my place to talk about Larry's life, but I mean, if you have a sibling, then imagine, imagine whatever was going on, with your sibling, and then your sibling happens to be, the most famous guy that ever lived in the field you're in. So it's an interesting, but Larry on his own is a great guy and really funny and really, an excellent writer, a terrific artist, and he was I learned a lot from him as as a mentor, as a friend. I still see him regularly, and
well, I never remember seeing him at conventions.
Yeah.
Was he a convention goer, or
maybe he's been to 2 or 3 conventions? He's not.
Not a public guy.
Not a public guy, and there's no reason he shouldn't be. He's very. I remember there was at least one San Diego where there was a profile panel of him several years ago, and he's got a lot of great stories. He knew everybody,
Sure.
That, he was the guy. A lot of the origin stories of Thor, Iron Man.
Yep.
Ant-Man.
Oh, I forgot about Iron Man. Yes,
yeah,
that's right.
Those are a lot of those origin stories and early stories were written by Larry from very short premises by Stan, and of course, history will never really know how much Kirby or other
Sure.
artists may have contributed, but I know, that Larry certainly wrote. You can see the stories that Larry wrote at pace differently than the ones that are credited to Stan or other people. And he had, I think Larry would actually thumbnail the stories and then write the dialogue. And I don't know if he, and then do it what's called full script style. He would, instead of plot first, he would do the entire script. Here's page 1, panel 1. Here's the action. Here's the dialogue. Panel 2, action, dialogue. He was and is, in some ways very similar to Stan, in some ways very different. But he's not. He certainly is not in search of publicity or of public appearance or glory. He's got a healthy sense of self and is proud of his work as he should be. But he's his own person.
That's cool. No, I was just interested in, again, working for him, and if you just ever saw them, in the work dynamic, what it was like.
Well, it's funny. Larry has mostly been a freelancer, but at the time he has been an editor, including, at the Seaboard and on the British books. And so it's very funny. My own personal editing style, I guess it's, among my heaviest influences are Larry, Louise Simonson, and Jim Shooter, which are certainly three disparate styles and influences to have, So
that's cool, though. That's an interesting combination. Go on.
I think, Shooter, I worked very closely with Shooter for many years, and Jim had a very definite idea of what he wanted, what he thought comics should be. He had a real philosophy of storytelling, of what was a hero, of he had definite ideas that he was that I think he had probably amassed from his mentors like Mort Weisinger, and I'm not sure how much work he did for Julie, but a lot of the DC guys, but especially Mort, and Jim had sort of reverse engineered when he was a child. He reverse engineered Marvel comics to see what made them tick. So he had.
That's so funny, and I like the way you said that, because the new Iron Man, the woman, has been, that's part of her origin, is that she reverse engineered some armor. So you can say Jim Shooter is the Riri Williams of the night.
I guess that would be. I had to give that one some thought, but.
No, but I know what you mean, and I'm really glad you mentioned that connection to Mort Weisinger, because Jim has that rep of being a kind of a bully editor, and I know some creators that I've spoken to, they offered it up right away. I know Gene Colan was no Jim Shooter fan, and don't get me wrong, because again, Jim Shooter's a really talented guy. He was a hell of a writer. I loved all those Legion stories, and it blows my mind that he's 13 and 14 cranking this shit out.
Pretty, having reverse engineered the Marvel comics. Look, not every editor is every freelancer's cup of tea. Not every match is a match made in heaven. But by the same token, you don't have to love somebody to create good comics with them.
Absolutely, sure.
Many good comics, just like many good movies, have been made by people who don't actually speak to each other in real life.
A lot of music is made that way too.
Yes. That sort of gets lost to history, and what it's sort of as an editor, of course, I'd always pull my hair out about people who were late. If something was late, if you missed shipping, if there was only 11 issues when you were supposed to have 12 out in a year, and then of course that as a staff person, that's how you should feel. If you're missing one issue of a profitable book, then that's a big impact on the company's bottom line. By the same token, when history looks back, nobody really knows if Banana Man number 33 shipped 2 weeks late or not. They just know if it was good or bad, and if it influenced them, and so it's just funny, things that seem so urgent. Is it late? Is it going to miss you? And again, I don't want to minimize. Those are real concerns. You have a product that's based on being there predictably every month.
Yes.
And if it's there, and if it's not there, and your customer's there, they're going to spend their money on something else and lose the rhythm of buying your thing. So it's a real concern. But in retrospect, when you look at whatever your favorite a collected edition of a comic is or something, you don't know, nor do you care, and most of the people involved with it probably don't even remember, whether it came out. But Jim was very, was very concerned about that, which was very good for the company. Marvel had sort of lost its focus on getting out the comics on time to the people who wanted them. To nobody's fault. It was just sort of that stuff happens. So he was a big influence, and it's, again, having a philosophy of what's a story, what's a hero. Louise was a terrific model of how to, of what's a story, all that same stuff, plus how to deal with people to get their best work out of them, and to have editorial influence without it being overpowering and overwhelming, but making people feel like it really was a true collaboration. And Larry was and is just an overall talented guy with an overview of story and art and what makes an effective comic and what makes a strong cover, and again, very good at dealing with people and making them feel valued and feel like that they want to do their best work for you. That's so much of being an editor is sort of being a cheerleader or being an editor is different for every person you deal with. Some people need or want very little input, and that's always that's where editorial problems always come in, where somebody needs input but doesn't want it, Right?
Sure.
And of course, it's a judgment call, but that's what you're paid for as an editor. Some people really like having input. For some people, you play good cop, bad cop, father, mother, psychiatrist. You play 100 different roles, and it's different for every freelance creator you deal with. I mean, as I often say, some creators think I'm the best editor they ever worked with. Some people think I'm the worst editor they ever worked with. I'm the same guy, so there's got to be something about the personal connection. Whereas, some people, if you make a suggestion, or even, God forbid, a mandate that something has to be changed, hate you for the smallest suggestion, and other people go, oh, that's a really good idea, or I don't like that idea, but I see why you're saying that. Let's try to make something that works for both of us. Some people are more interested in collaborating, others are not, and then there's just the one-on-one chemistry between people that happens or doesn't happen. That's the hardest thing. Sure. Is always, inheriting a book, inheriting a title that there's already an established team on, because it's so hard to know what made that relationship work. Or, I think some editors if they get a book, automatically fire the team on it just because they don't want to have to deal with negotiating that,
The new relationship.
Yeah, it's like, I'm a new guy, you're fired,
Right.
Well, yeah. Most people, tread a middle ground, I guess if they like what's being done or think there's potential. Every decision you make as an editor is impacts somebody's income. I mean, it's a really, and somebody's career. So it's not, while I guess, in a world of just automatons where you just plug people in to do stuff, it would be, this book is not selling enough, we must put in people who will make it sell. The fact is,
sure,
there's no secret formula. You don't know that putting on, new people will make it better, if or sell more, and every decision you make impacts whether somebody can pay their mortgage or not. It's with some power comes some responsibility. Is the
well, in that capacity, who are some of the newcomers that you kind of gave the first shots to? Are we? By the way, it's an hour 11. I don't want to monopolize. Are you okay talking? I don't want to.
How about like another 20 minutes? Is that
okay, man? Of course. No. And forgive me. I don't mean to.
Oh no. Obviously, once I get started.
No, that's great.
No,
we're for it.
And we didn't even get to the Clone Saga.
Well, I know. I know. I kind of feel like this is Frost Nixon and your filibuster.
Oh, well, that's okay. Well,
I'm teasing
I'm
you.
just not sure if I'm Frost or Nixon here, but that would make me Nixon, wouldn't it? Let's find another metaphor, okay? That would be.
That's good. You got the knowledge. But no, real quick, give me a grocery list of some of the newcomers.
I don't know if I gave them literally their first work, but people who I'd like to think I sort of helped get on the map were Ron Friends, Mark Bagley. I think those would probably be the main ones. I mean, I worked with Fabian early in his career as his editor on the New Warriors, of course. I'm sure the minute we end the conversation, I'll think of like 10 other people. But those were some of the
Those are really great guys, man. I'm a big Friends fan. Bagley's amazing, absolutely, and Fabian's a hell of a writer, absolutely, man.
And Ron Friends, I think is underappreciated. I think Ron has done a lot of important comics and always dynamic, exciting work.
Absolutely. Honestly, again, there's a guy that I missed some of his early work, but Spider-Girl, him and DeFalco.
Yeah.
That was fantastic.
Oh, you should read the Thor and Thunderstrike that he did with DeFalco, and of course his Spider-Man with DeFalco from the 80s. I mean, that stuff is really, obviously Tom's a terrific writer, but he and Ron are really, when they work together, they kind of one organism. They really thoroughly discuss the stories, and it's sort of, you always hear the stories about how creative teams, bicker or resent each other or jealous of each other, whatever. Tom and Ron were like, were and are the exact opposite. They really, they have, lengthy phone discussions about how they can, about what the story should be and who the character is, and and then Tom goes and writes usually a plot. They work with Marvel style.
Okay.
But they're certainly the textbook, like positive example of what the Marvel style can accomplish, and to this day they're very close friends and in regular contact. And then it was great. I did at the Wizard Show in Pittsburgh. Ron lives in Pittsburgh, so I did some panels with them and just hung out with them. And again, it's very touching, to see it's a case. As I said, a few minutes ago, people don't have to love each other to put out terrific comics, but in this case, these guys do, and it's very,
that's cool.
They knew each other before, but I was the one who put them together as a team, and it's very kind of gratifying to see that.
That's awesome. No, that's fantastic. Now, let me avail your concerns about me bringing up the Clone Saga. Because, honestly, it's well documented. It's fine. But what I am interested in, because I just had Dan Jurgens on a couple weeks ago, and just in passing, I'm like, what do you think of, it's kind of funny now there is this very seriously strong contingent of Ben Reilly fans that are like, hey, fuck you. I like that. And I like Ben Reilly. And I'm a Scarlet Spider fan, and there's, and I think it's fascinating. I have I was gone. I wasn't there.
Well, I would say, I know there's one particular website. Is that what you mean? We say it's well documented? Or?
Oh, no, honestly, I just mean in terms of all the various publications. And I even want to say in that Titan book that you're a part of.
Right.
And frankly, it's in a box somewhere, or I would have dug it out before we were talking to have a bit more frame of reference and everything. But yeah, I thought the Clone Saga was very well documented in that.
Which Titan book? I don't even know what.
Oh, it was all the various writers talking about Spider-Man.
Oh, that one. The one is that the one? Is that the one that Tom did the interviews?
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's one, and I don't know what I don't remember. I don't think Sean Howe really went that deep in it in his Marvel Comics history.
I don't think the story he was telling, I don't think it was that important.
Yeah, germane to it.
The story, I mean, again, I'm always happy to talk about the Clone Saga, but I've spoken about it a lot, and that's from my own particular perspective. Obviously, it was a risky storyline. The era called for risky storylines, and we kind of enjoyed it. It was sort of an adrenaline rush. I had a great deal of hesitancy about it. However, what we did have was great enthusiasm from my writers. my writers were so enthusiastic that we had a meeting in a hotel conference room, and the people having the conference next door complained to the hotel management that we were making too much noise, which for me is like, holy crap, we're so enthusiastic that people are complaining about us, you know?
Yeah,
I mean,
sure.
you know, and it wasn't that we were like having fist fights. We were just like, you know, everybody talking in raised voices about this aspect of the story, that aspect. So I had a great deal of doubts about it. I think, you know, and I, in my own mind, built in, you know, various backdoors out of it. I think, Tom.
Doubts about it in terms of just the actual, like, core of the story?
Say again?
Doubts about it in terms of, like, the actual...
Yeah, of course. You know, look, nobody... The idea that you would say everything you've been reading for the past 20 years is about a different guy is a daring risk to take.
Sure.
And, you know, so, I wanted... And look, it's comics, so people undo continuity all the time. But I mean, there was not, you know, that was still relatively a while ago, so there wasn't that much doing and undoing in that sense.
Well,
but my writers were enthusiastic. They were really, really into it. They managed to convince Tom, who was not into it, not only to do it, but to write to write Spectacular Spider-Man. And you know, it was my personal theory is that the comics industry as a whole was going through a collective nervous breakdown then, right? The boom had happened, the bust was starting. The Clone Saga, you know, I mean, Spider-Man sales were declining too, not like everything else, but the Clone Saga turned it around. The Clone Saga sold like crazy. So people were buying it. And I feel that there was a rush to judgment on the part of certain fan magazines and certain columnists and fans who, I mean, it's touching how passionate and concerned and how much they loved Spider-Man, were worried about what they thought was going to happen. But there were people commenting on it who had never read Spider-Man, who'd never written Spider-Man, who had never read any of the Clone Saga, and they were going, you know, so I think, you know, the industry was going through this implosion, this collective nervous breakdown, and Marvel itself used used Scarlet Spider as their mascot. That was their emblem for how things were going to be great and turn around in the Marvolution, I don't know if you recall that. So I think there was this collective freak out, and the clone became the handiest symbol of it, and it was an easy target, but the book sold like crazy. A lot of people did like them, and I think we're just seeing that now, that Marvel, I mean, you could say if Marvel did one reprint that maybe it was some kind of whatever, you know, macabre inside joke that they were willing to print. But I mean, there's been volume after volume of the Clone Saga, of the Ben Reilly saga, right? I mean, look, the controversial thing was, this guy is not Spider-Man. And then, of course, they undid that, you know, but I mean, you have to, in terms, I don't know, it seemed to me like a vast overreaction that had nothing to do with the content and everything to do with people freaking out about the state of the comics industry. And then in the middle of that, there was a big shakeup internally at Marvel and a big corporate restructuring, which led me to feel that it would be good for me to leave. So, you know, I left under my own steam. I went to work for Byron Price and started for him a line of digital comics that were so new it was called Virtual Comics, and you know, went on to my various other writing and editing and packaging adventures over the years. But yeah, the clone thing, it was you know, that's if you have any specific question, but that's sort of my feeling about it, is that it was an overreaction to what was, you know, a pretty good storyline. Then, of course, the company decided it was doing so well that they would stretch it out for, you know, from a relatively short storyline to an ongoing storyline that would never end. And I think a couple of the writers have told me they didn't have backdoors as far as they were concerned, that, you know, Peter was Ben and Ben was Peter, and that was that. And, you know, maybe they had to convince themselves of that. But, you know, editorially, I and Tom, I don't know if we had the same backdoors, but we definitely both had, you know, moments where we could point to and go, that's the moment where we fooled you, and that they, you know. And, of course, if you look back, you said you'd read the original Clone stories, you know, there's that moment where Peter gets, like, the DNA tested or whatever he does, and he's standing on a rooftop, and instead of reading the report to confirm that he is indeed himself. He says, "I know I'm me, and I don't need to read this." And he throws it and it scatters to the wind, which indicates to me, and I guess it must have indicated to Terry Cavanaugh, who came up with the original idea to bring back the clone, is that somebody was setting up future stories there. You don't do something like that without thinking, I may come back to that someday. I guess
sure.
I think was it Len? Who was the writer on that? Was it Len? I never.
No, it was Jerry Conway. It was
Jerry.
Conway.
I never asked Jerry. I should probably ask Jerry. Jerry, if you're out there, did you plant that clue on purpose?
I'm gonna have to ask him as well. You're 100% right. Well, and also I remember that What If, where they brought the spider clone back, and I loved that. And again, I remembered the original story. So, well, and the fan media reaction that happened then. I wonder what you think of Captain America: Hail Hydra and the backlash that caused. Even as we speak, last week, Riri Williams, I think, got an equal amount of applause, but also a very strong reaction to, oh, great, a white guy's writing another, character of color.
My feel, having been an insider, I think somebody in publicity is doing their job right. Fans love to get. At least certain vocal fans on the internet love to get upset about anything.
Sure.
No, I don't think it was a slap in the face to Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. I don't think they were saying Captain America was a Nazi and had always been a Nazi. I think they did their job, excite controversy and sell comics. So I never saw it as anything other than that, and a lot of the criticism I saw online was, as always, from people who hadn't actually read the story.
Yep, absolutely.
So,
right.
But look, I think, the job of a comics company and of a comics editor and of comics creators is to, readers think they want one thing. They think they want good old Spidey, and it's not. And again, not a judgment on readers. Just because this happens to me with stuff that I'm, a fan of. You want things to be predictable and regular. The world is so crazy. You want to be able to know that you can go buy a Spider-Man comic or a Batman comic and kind of know. But in practice, people, as often as not, don't buy those comics. They go, I don't need to buy it. I know what's going to happen. So your job as a comics person, as a comics professional, is to piss readers off just enough that they have to buy the next issue to see how you're screwing up. I can't believe they did that. I'm so mad I'm going to buy the next issue, right?
Exactly.
So you have to tread a fine line because, at a certain point, they may stop buying. You may tick them off so much that they decide that they don't. But your job and what people want, that as a consumer of media yourself. You want something that gets you just upset enough to keep coming back, but not so upset that you leave forever, And
I think people can point to TV shows that do that. Certainly, as episodic and each year has its own story arc, the way a lot of shows do and stuff. No, I can even think of a couple of USA shows that I was a big fan of, and then they took a left turn, and I'm like, I don't think I'm watching it anymore.
Right.
I don't care.
And that's right. But then maybe in a year you go, I haven't watched that for a while. Check it out.
Exactly. Yep.
That's the thing with genre storytelling. Right. There's genre expectations, and how far can you test those limits, and how far can you push. It's fun. I saw, an obscure Western on Turner Classics last night. I don't even remember the movie. It had Robert Taylor and I'll think of his name. The guy from Pickup on South Street, who's the
Pickup on what?
Pickup on South Street. You know that movie? It's a Sam Fuller.
No, and I know, and I'm an old movie buff, and shame on me that I don't know.
Well, go watch it tonight. It's called Pickup on South Street, directed by Samuel Fuller. It's I
love Sam Fuller. Sure.
Oh well, then you must watch it.
I know. Shame on me. Well, that's what I'm saying, man. No, I'm really new to I've got a lot more Fuller to watch. I've got a lot more Bud Bedecker to watch, and
good. And even pronounce Bedecker right. So that's which I've never done.
I heard James Garner say it in an interview.
So I'll think of a very famous actor who, of course, I'm blanking out. Anyways, it was a story about two former criminal, bank robbers who were friends in the West, in the Old West, and one of them becomes a sheriff, but he knows where they buried some loot that they stole together years ago, and and so the last 10 minutes of the movie. Right, there's going to be a showdown between these guys, but the movie's from 1958, so there's already been 30 years or more, 40, 30, 40, 50 years of showdowns in Westerns. So you can see everybody involved in the movie, the director and the writer and the actors struggling to make this showdown different. It was also the era of the psychological Western, so everybody trying to Richard Widmark. That's who the other star is. Richard.
Oh,
Widmark.
Great! Oh,
so everybody trying to make the showdown different, and it turned out that it was really like a very dull showdown. It was like, I got what they were trying to do. It's like, let's do this thing different here than you would expect us, and then. By the time it ended, you just kind of went, "Oh, thank God, that's over already," But I think comics runs into that problem where any genre does, where you want to fulfill the expectations, and that's sort of a definition of genres, that it will fulfill certain expectations, but you want to do it in a surprising way, and that it becomes a challenge, and then sometimes that's where those controversial storylines come from, and then. Again, so it's 20 years past the Clone Saga, and Marvel certainly has no problem, nor should they, printing, fancy color, not just like essential volumes, but color reprints of the Clone stuff, because it was done. Just look at the names on the credits. Some of the top people in comics. So even if whatever you felt about. And eventually, of course, they did undo the thing anyway, so I could blame on. But but I get why. I do think it was an overreaction in general, fueled by a few influential writers coming at it from a place of caring. But I think again, over fan writers coming at it from a place of caring. But I think it was overreacting, and again, tribute to how much they loved Spider-Man and associated characters. But again, that's that you just have that constant push and pull between doing something daring and shocking and doing the same old thing.
I understand. No, and I appreciate the explanation because, like I said, I do think that's kind of in the air right now from a fandom standpoint.
Right.
And sometimes you need to hear that perspective to remember, just how it works. That's all, and what the attempt is.
Sure.
And yeah, God.
Oh, I appreciate that.
No, absolutely, man. My pleasure. And truly, because to wrap up, because I don't want to overtax you, but Right Now was really one of my favorite magazines, and I was sorry that it ended.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun to do. I loved working with Tomorrow's. John Morrow and his crew are just a pleasure to work with. What it came down to, as you would imagine, is that sales. I mean, there was a fairly sizable hardcore of people who really loved the magazine and appreciated what I was doing with it and what we were doing with it. And that was very gratifying, and it was very, to this day, I get people much like you telling me how much they loved it, and but I think it just didn't have enough people to make it worth anybody's while to keep doing it financially. But thank you. I put a lot of work and a lot of heart into it. What I was proudest of that I did with it, oddly enough, was part of my my tenacious, annoying parts of my character, where if you read interviews with a lot of people, and this would happen, how did you get into, you say, how do you get into the business? And they say, well, I was talking to John Byrne or whoever one day, and then they go on, and you go, wait a minute, pardon me, how did you get to be talking to John Byrne one day? What? Oh, well, because, and then they'll, I would have to like sort of excavate with people, like how they got to the point of being somebody who even had an opportunity to get in. And of course, you can't duplicate somebody else's life, but I thought it was useful to do that just so people reading it would think, well, of course I can't be this person, but what in my life is similar? Who is a cousin of a friend of a colleague? I mean, where in the chain of human interactions is there somebody or some way that I can get my work noticed or get my foot in the door? And especially in the age of the internet, and Facebook and stuff like that. But even before that, so I thought it was interesting that a lot of people took for granted how they literally got their start. Just so many people who were like smart, insightful people would just say, stuff like, "Yeah, I was talking to whoever." How did you get to talk to that person? What put you in a position where you could be talking to that person, or or have a meeting with them? So it's funny that. And we did a lot of other, I think, good stuff. But thank you, I appreciate it. The magazine was a lot of fun to do, and to this day, I do get a lot of compliments on it. So if everybody had bought 10 copies, we'd still be doing it. But but I don't expect you to be that dedicated.
Do they keep the trade in print, the collection?
No, unfortunately. You mean the best of?
Yeah.
No, that's.
How about digitally?
I'd like it to go. I would like it to be back in print. But so write to John. Let him know you'd like it to be back in print.
Write to John Cook. Yeah.
No, John Morrow.
Or John Morrow. John Morrow. Shame on me. I see him every San Diego. You're right. I buy that's my Sunday ritual. I buy all the, like you were saying about how Michael Urie in back issue had something new on Dazzler, and that's my thing. It's like I go to for the flight home. I have like a stack of like several Tomorrow's magazines.
There you go. Right? No, well, look, everything they do. I mean, I'm not. I don't know if I'm a big. I don't know if I find, they have a magazine about Legos that's very popular. I don't know if Legos are really my thing. If it was, I'm sure I would need to have that magazine. But but everything they do is really terrifically done. Alter Ego and Draw and Back Issue and all that stuff. So I would love to see the best of back in print. John, I think is doesn't think it's the right time, and he's the publisher. He may well be right. On the other hand, if he gets deluged with requests and demands from people to put it back out, then it'd be fine with me to redo it or do a second volume or something. Because we had a lot of, again, that's where I did that interview with Eisner that was just that gets reprinted periodically. It was, and again, it's just sort of. I asked some questions. It was Will. Basically, it's not really that hard to get a good interview out of Will Eisner. Well, now it is, but when he was alive, it wasn't that hard to get a great interview out of Will Eisner. You just got to go, and then he's Will Eisner.
Yeah, great story. Obviously, great storyteller. Gee, really?
Yeah.
Who would have thought? But I understand. I did get to see him live a couple times.
Right. But check out that thing online. If it's still on YouTube, it's the comic book greats, Stan Lee and Will Eisner. You'll see the rapport that the two of them have is really very touching, and they say a lot of smart stuff. And you get to watch Will draw too.
Oh, that's true, because I remember from the other artists that were on there. I do want to acknowledge, because it was something that I heard from Diana Schutz. I mentioned it to you when emailing you to put this together. Your ambition to have some sort of comic book database of these interviews, because man, I'll tell you, I know that the Comics Journal guys have a lot of great written and also audio of like panels and different interviews that have happened over the years. And I really do think it's important, and I'm sure you feel the same way, that the history is maintained and that the story is told properly, and it isn't that second guessing by people that really don't know the behind-the-scenes facts of, just how people were or how they were to work with, what went into the creation. I mean, though there are mysteries to, Barry Allen's creation, because we didn't have alter ego or Amazing Heroes back in the 80s, or comics interview to kind of set the record, I think.
Well, I mean, and look, as with all history, you have to talk to a lot of people, because everybody has their own blind spots and
absolutely
and things that they want to emphasize or not emphasize, or just that they don't remember accurately. So, but starting on what you had said to start out the question or statement or whatever the heck it was, look, every time you go to a convention, there are panels. right? And certainly many of them are not audio or videotape, which always breaks my heart. Because it's kind of the last thing you think of. You're hustling so much to get the personnel together and to get the panel work, and these days to put together like a PowerPoint slideshow, and then you go, oh man, is that. I guess the good news is that there's a lot of people in audiences who now do record these things. But the point, the thing that I guess I said to Diana, and that I say a lot, is that, right, if anytime you're at a convention and somebody's making a videotape, or just somebody has their phone on is making a recording, or anytime you see somebody shooting, how many times have you been to conventions and seen people shooting interviews for documentaries that never come out, right?
Yep.
And I know, life is long, art is short, or the other way around.
No, I agree with you.
So but the fact is that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of hours of recordings of panels, of interviews with people. I participate in a bunch myself, stuff that's just gathering, digital dust somewhere. And if time and money were no object, I would just spend. You know how Jay and Silent Bob went around the country beating up kids at the end of Jay and Silent Bob? I would do that. I would travel from city to city, and I would just beg, borrow, steal, cajole, pay, do whatever I had to get people. Say, that documentary you started 20 years ago, you're probably not going to finish it. How about contributing your footage of the interview with this person who's been dead for 20 years to this database? Yeah, so there's somewhere somebody really rich with a lot of time on their hands and a lot of passion should do that, should just put together some kind of archive.
I'm working on that lottery scheme, and if it happens, then I swear to you, I'll do it.
Okay, well, I'll hold to that. I will watch the lottery results and see if you win. Is there a minimum you have to win? I mean, I assume if you win $10, you're not going to do it, right?
Yeah, no, definitely not $10. It's not going to be a scratch off is going to do it. Unfortunately, no. I mean, some sort of Powerball, and that, of course, kidding. But no, honestly, that's one of the reasons why I started Word Balloon. Was to, and you're right, because I don't mean to sound that like it just has to be chapter and verse of, no, this is how it was created, period. No, it is those moments in panel, and even our conversation as well. I mean, this is why I think it's interesting. I guess I can't think of a better word than set the record straight, but it's just great to get observations from the creative community while this stuff is being made.
And just to capture people while they're alive, while they're in their primes, or while they're in, whatever period in their life or career you catch them.
Yes.
Just to have that material, because I find that, look, I'm sure I'll get off this call and say to my wife, why the hell did I say that? Whatever it was. I'm sure there'll be something I don't know if I should have said, So I think even the most guarded person, you see an interview with them, and suddenly there's like this, they say something, they go, I don't think they meant to say that, And it's just sort of interesting to get these kind of glimpses behind the curtain, but just to see, what... you can read 100 interviews with Gil Kane or whoever, but it's not until you see footage of Gil Kane speaking, you go, oh, that's what it was, something like what it was like to be in a room with Gil Kane,
Sure.
I think, I think there are other, I think movies, I guess maybe, and TV, just maybe partly because they are movies and TV, seem to be better about documenting and kind of warehousing that kind of stuff. But I bet there's a ton of stuff even in those media that's not, and look, you could spend your whole life, I'm sure, watching YouTube videos of your favorite creators. It's not like that stuff, like none of that stuff is there, but a lot of it isn't. And it just seems a shame that all the work that people put into getting those interviews that,
Agreed.
I mean, again, I have bin part of, and am part of sort of, documentaries that were started that kind of stalled, and
life gets in the way.
Yeah.
Life gets in the way of these projects.
And then this stuff, and again, especially because it's digital, right? Then nobody knows what it is, especially if the technology changes and nobody can watch it. I mean, how many times do you hear about somebody who had some great archive of whatever type, and then it's like, it got thrown out because nobody knew what it was, and you go, oh man, it's in a landfill.
Microcassette interview that I did in the early '90s with Muhammad Ali is a prime example of that. I know exactly what you mean.
Yep, there you go. So that's sort of my my dream that I hope somebody does, or maybe some organization. I mean, it sounds like more of a thing that an organization would do. So maybe somebody would hear this and become inspired. Maybe some 12-year-old hearing this now will be the person who goes on to dedicate their life to it. I hope so.
There you go. No, absolutely, man. Well, we didn't even scratch the surface, and I really appreciate you talking to me. Real fast, I know you're coming to Chicago in August.
I'm coming to Chicago. I'm coming to all the Wizard shows this year, so anytime you see a Wizard show, I will be there doing panels. And if you stuck with listening to me for an hour and a half, then you probably would like my panels too. But although I do let other people talk more on, since I'm usually not the subject of the panels. But yeah, I do panels with artists, combinations of artists, people who are known in history. And this year, Chicago is going to be the 40th anniversary of the Chicago Con, so a bunch of people who started that will be doing a panel. And look up the Wizard World has a list. I'll be doing all the shows this year, probably next year as well. That next year seems a long way off, but it's not really. I got a bunch of projects that I'll be announcing soon, hopefully, that people can know about. In my book, Superman on the Couch, and the Rough Guide to Graphic Novels, and the Stan Lee Universe, and back issues of Right Now, or back issues of Back Issue if you like Back Issue. But that's a very
there you go.
I hope your listeners certainly feel free to check that stuff out, and come say hi at the end of this month. I'm not going to be at San Diego this year, but I will be at the Wizard Show in Columbus, in Columbus, Ohio. At
the end of the month.
Last weekend of this month. So I'll be there doing panels and at Artist Alley. So if you should be in Columbus or in the vicinity, come by, say hello, and that's the story.
That's excellent, man. No, I will see you in August, and I know a lot of my listeners have seen you in action at conventions and panels and stuff. So that's great. And when one of the new projects is ready, please come back, because we could talk about Superman on the Couch and your history of the Jewish creators that started the business and everything. And no, I'd love to get more stories from you.
Well, if you want to do a sequel, let me know. You can see it's very hard to get me to talk about myself.
That's all right, man. All right. No, honestly,
John, thank you.
That's Danny Fingeroff. Make sure you stop by and say hello to him if you're coming to the Chicago Wizard World Comic Con. That'll be in about 2 weeks. Yeah, 2 weeks. I want to say the 18th through, the 18th through that weekend. So, and let him know that you heard him on Word Balloon, by all means. So that's what I'm going to do when I see him. But that was great, and I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. Word Balloon today was brought to you by In Stock Trades at InStockTrades.com. There are great deals happening now at In Stock Trades. Don't forget, as always, if your orders are $50 or more, you receive free shipping. They make it easy when you think of some of the books that are out there. For example, Tarzan, the complete Joe Kubert years from Dark Horse Archives. This is an incredible volume, and it's at a great price, 42% off, $17.39. Just sit back and appreciate the genius of Joe Kubert. And really, Tarzan was a great, great run for Joe. I remember it from the 70s, and you can enjoy it now at this amazing price. You can get JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Battle Tendencies. This is, it's JoJo's Bizarre Adventures, and I think the name of the story is Battle Tendency. Volume 4, this is a great manga book, and it's at 30% off, just $13.99. You can get the Harley Quinn mask and book set, Volume 1, Hot in the City. Great stuff from Jimmy Palmiotti and Amanda Connor. 40% off, $19.24. You can get, of course, Suicide Squad, the Most Wanted Deadshot collection, which features the writings of Brian Bucoletto, and Victor Bogdanovic is the artist. And, man, I'll tell you, Brian is a hell of a writer, and I'm really glad that it was Kyle Higgins that told me, hey, man, really pay attention to what Brian's doing. Because I was loving what Francis and Brian were doing, and he's like, check out Brian's solo stuff. And he's right. Brian's a hell of a writer. Got to see him for 2 seconds at San Diego. Check out his volume on Deadshot. It's 50% off. It's just $8.49. Some of the great deals happening at InStockTrades.com. Don't take my word for it. Go to the website. Check it out for yourself. Prices you won't believe on great books. InStockTrades.com. Thanks again for listening. Thank you, League of Word Balloon listeners, for your support. More San Diego content is coming. The reason for the delay, it's not a really delay per se, because you've seen I've been cranking it out, but I wanted to take a break from it and put out these last 2 episodes because they were kind of time sensitive. I wanted to have Danny's an interview out there with plenty of time before Wizard Chicago to get a sense of what he's doing with the convention programming that he puts out, along with his stories. And the same goes with the variety television book that Mary Beth Liebman co-wrote with Steve Bender, and I thought that was really interesting. And also, that book's been out for a month, and I think they wanted the publicity as soon as possible, so I was happy to do that. I've got 2 panels still to come from San Diego. The original art panel with Sal Abenati, where I intend to include visuals. It will be an audio podcast, but also you might want to check out the YouTube production I'm going to put together for that, because I will put in a lot of the images that we were describing as we were doing the panel, because I think it would just make a little more sense for you to have the full effect. In fact, Word Balloon podcasts have been coming out via YouTube now for about a month. It started with R.J. Ryan, and every new episode since then is also available at YouTube. So if you want to get it that way, that's great. Who knows what kind of listenership we might reach tapping the YouTube audience. That certainly is bigger than any other pool I could possibly be in. So happy to do that. But when I have more visually intense presentations and panels, I'm going to take that extra step and make sure that the YouTube video has that kind of content in it as well. The other panel, of course, on comic book films from the 40s and 50s that have been forgotten, but were very significant comic book films and worthy of your attention. And also Trevor Goring, the wonderful comic book artist and storyboard artist for Hollywood, working on films like Watchmen and Spawn and the X-Men X2, and he did the Fantastic Four films, the early Tim Story films, and then also, continues to work. He did Thor: The Dark World recently, and so he has a great perspective on the comic films of the 90s and early 2000s, comparing things in this post-Iron Man world, because I think that's really where the seismic shift really happened. Yes, people say Sam Raimi, and those are great movies. Whatever. But it really seems to me that, the real, when the Marvel films really started with Iron Man, that's really representative of the current era that we are in. So great to get his perspective on how comic book films have changed from the 90s and early 2000s to where we are today. And that presentation is also coming up in just a few days here on Word Balloon. Thanks a lot for listening. More great conversations with new people and old favorites as well in the days and weeks and months ahead. Stay with me. Thanks for being on the ride on Word Balloon. Until next time, Word Balloon is a copyright feature of Shaky Productions, copyright 2016.